This is a baby. One of 385,000 babies born every day. This baby is special. Probably never know it. So today is November 15th, 2022, and this baby is the 8th billionth person on the planet. Humanity has hit a new milestone. Happy birthday. So yes, on November 15th, a baby was born. And that baby is the 8th billionth person on the planet, a new milestone in human population. Most of human history, the growth of the world was very, 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 very slow. However, since the Industrial Revolution in the last 200 years, the world's population has gone through unprecedented growth. At the end of the 18th century, the world's population was hovering just beneath 1 billion people. The UN estimates that the human population first hit 1 billion in 1804. This was the year Napoleon crowned himself emperor. It would take 123 more years until the population hit its next milestone in 1927, when it hit 2 billion. It's from here, though, that the world population really accelerated. It took 33 years to reach 3 billion in 1960. Thereafter, it took 14 years for the global population to reach 4 billion in 1974, 13 years to reach 5 billion in 1987, 12 years to reach 6 billion in 1999, and 12 years to reach 7 billion in October 2011, and the 8 billionth person in November 2022. That's 11 years. However, population growth has slowed, with the rate of growth peaking in the 1960s. So let's just think about this for a moment. In 1922, there were less than 2 billion people on the planet. In 100 years, it has increased by 6 billion. The UN projects the world population will peak at about 10.9 billion people by the end of the century, but researchers cannot actually agree on this exact number. The Lancet Institution, funded by the Global Burdens of Disease Studies, believes the world's population will peak around 2064 at 9.7 billion, before declining to 8.8 billion by 2100. There's quite a good chance the 10th billionth person will never be born. But what demographers can agree on is that growth is not the same everywhere. Most of the world's population growth will be coming from Africa and the Middle East, while the rest of the world, especially in Europe and Asia, have already likely had their population peak or will soon peak, and are now beginning a slow decline that will hasten and speed up as the years go by. This is a process known as the demographic transition model, a 5-stage transition that reflects the evolution of society since the Industrial Revolution, from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates. For a society to maintain their population, a fertility rate of 2.1 children per parent is needed, one for dad and one for mum, with the 0.1 reflecting that not everyone reaches adulthood to reproduce themselves. However, in every region of the world that has industrialized, they've experienced a drastic drop-off in fertility rates. The reason for this is varied. These include lower infant mortality rates and the financial expense that children are. In pre-industrial society, children were actually a source of income, helping boost productivity on the farms because, extra hands, as well as providing retirement security. However, as the world industrialized and people moved away from farms to the city, children became more of an expense, so people had less. Furthermore, better opportunities for women has also led to a decline, with women no longer burdening to just being one thing in the world. And of course, people are having less kids because more of them actually surviving. You don't need to have 7 kids with hoping that maybe 2 or 3 of them will survive, because, they'll all survive. This is actually the main reason for such high population growth over the last 2 centuries, has been because of this transition. At first, the death rates dropped before the birth rates. So, instead of having 8 kids and maybe 3 or 4 possibly surviving, suddenly they're all surviving and reaching adulthood. They may have kids, slightly less, and the process continues until it drops below replacement level. This has happened in every single industrialized nation on Earth. And there is evidence to suggest the demographic transition is only accelerating. The West began industrialization in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It took 170 years for birth rates to fall below replacement levels in the West. In Asia, this happened in a generation or two. Let's look at South Korea. In 1960, for an example, an average woman in South Korea had 6 kids in their lifespan. By the 1980s, it had dipped below the replacement level, and today South Korea has the lowest birth rate on Earth at only 0.84, well below the replacement level, and their population has already begun to decline, with South Korea's population expected to drop by more than 50%, 53% to be exact, to 24 million by 2100. And South Korea isn't alone in this drastic depopulation to come. Japan, China, Russia, Germany, Italy, pretty much all of Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe will have dramatic drops in their population over the next century and is now irreversible. The consequences of this will have a dramatic effect on the planet and society as we know it. So let's discuss the impacts of this decline. Well, let's firstly look at economics. The economic model that the world is based on is constant growth. But in 20 years, there'll be more people, more consumers, more innovation, more money, growth, more minds, more everything. But the reality for much of the world with a shrinking population is that growth isn't sustainable. Our model cannot sustain itself. The foundation of economic growth and economic theories won't be there. In likelihood, a new ism will need to be developed for this rapidly aging world. So the end of economic growth is coming. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. Let's look at Germany's population pyramid here from 2019. As you can see in Germany, the largest generation in Germany is this bulge in the middle, the 50 to 59-year-olds. In the short term, this means Germany will be a very productive economy. These are your most experienced workers with their highest skills and most money. But fast forward this pyramid to 2029, this demographic is now 60 to 69, and well, over 60s are retiring or retired. So can you see the problem here? Throughout history, this hasn't been a problem because a traditional population pyramid, well, it's a pyramid. It's smaller at the top and larger at the bottom. So traditionally, the young generation, the 10 to 19-year-olds, would be bigger than the 50 to 59-year-olds. However, as you can see in this pyramid, the young people, the 10 to 19-year-olds in this pyramid, are smaller. This is the generation that is replacing the biggest one, the smallest replacing the biggest. That's not good. So overall, there will be a reduction of the amount of working age people relative to the amount of retired people. Social services are maintained via taxation. And you know what old people need? They often need a lot of social security services. And you know what social security services are maintained by? Taxes. But if there are less workers, then there's less workers to tax, which means social security like age pensions, healthcare, and aged care systems, which become increasingly important to the older society, become increasingly difficult to fund or maintain. With less workers comes a reduction in the overall productivity in society, therefore the overall GDP declines, which means less investment into the economy, services such as health, defense, infrastructure, the overall standard of living declines. Thus, that country will need to increase taxes, or they will need to make cuts to the benefits, or the government goes further into debt, which is one of the reasons today Japan, which was pretty much the first country to go through this, has been going through this since the 1990s, has the highest debt ratio on the planet. And as a result, if we're looking at taxes, the burden of maintaining this ever-increasing elderly population will fall onto the shoulder of the younger generations. The reduction in population has a reduction in total economic output. With less people, then less things need to be made. A reverse of a growth model, a shrink model, so factories and stores close, foreign investment drops, as economic output drops. The declining economy, these countries can find itself in a permanent recession, creating more burden on the younger generations, only further exacerbate the issues of declining population, as a lower standing of living for young people will make it even more difficult for young people to have kids, ultimately resulting in less people being born, and thus the cycle continues. People want to have kids. Most surveys have shown that economics factors is the biggest reason as to why they don't have more. More people would want to have kids than they do, but because of financial reasons, this is the number one reasons why they don't. And if this problem continues and you keep getting this economic decline being exacerbated by this cycle that will go on, then this problem will only get worse. By 2050, the rate of elderly people is expected to drastically increase. In Europe, 34% of their population will be over 60, with Asia not far behind with 28%. Nations like Russia and China are amongst those that will be facing the most significant decline. In China, if you believe their data, has 1.4 billion people, the largest population in the world. However, that could halve to 700 million or even less by the end of the century, while Russia is also facing a significant crisis. In the short term, both of these countries have a very short time frame to assert themselves on the world stage, and this can be reflected in Russia's recent invasions of Ukraine. Russia's demographic collapse that is coming is one of the many reasons Russia has actually gone into Ukraine at this very time. Russia has been invaded 50 times in its history, all through similar choke points. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's territory was the smallest it had been in centuries. Russia wants to secure its borders before it's too late. If it doesn't, take Ukraine, they are vulnerable to invasion in the future from a future enemy, maybe NATO or something like that. And as Russia becomes older and older, and their population declines and declines, they won't be able to defend themselves. So from a Russian point of view, the act of invasion of Ukraine is a desperate move from a literal dying empire. If it does not secure its borders now, Russia won't survive. A result of demographic collapse will be more cases of Ukraines, where ambitious countries trying to secure their futures before it's too late will try and secure their borders. But due to the disastrous effects of what was meant to be a quick conquest for Russia, it looks like it has actually made the problem worse for Russia and has only hastened their collapse. Societal, the impacts of the aging world will be drastic, as the burden falls on the ever-decreasing younger population to help support their older parents. A risk of intergenerational conflict between the smaller, younger populations and the larger, older populations could likely play out. Another factor that could fuel intergenerational conflict, especially in the advanced developed democracies of the world, with a larger elderly base, they will hold more sway in the election cycles. So policies that will favor the larger, older voting base will get preferential over policies that favor the younger people. Even though if you want to try and fix this birth rate issue, you probably need to pass policies that would actually benefit younger people to get into the housing market, incentivize children, that kind of stuff. But again, the cycle will only continue. In order for countries to maintain their worker to retiree ratio, countries will need to also raise their retirement age. But there's a limit to how far this will go. Take a case like Italy. Italy, for example, if it wants to retain the same amount of worker to retirees that it has right now, it will need to raise its retirement age to 77 or admit 2.2 million immigrants annually to maintain its worker to retiree ratio. About 25% of Italian women do not have children, while another 25% only have one child. Raising the retirement age is something that will happen, but it will be hugely unpopular. But it has its limits. 77 is too old. And as people age, especially after 65, their productivity goes down due to cognitive and physical decline. Immigration is a solution, but it's been tried by much of the West. It is one of the reasons countries such as Germany during the Syrian refugee crisis had such an open border policy, and it worked. Temporarily. Germany's population increased for the first time in years. However, immigration has a major flaw. It can only really work as a temporary solution. Within a generation, the children of the immigrants, their birth rates are at very similar rates to that of a native population, so more immigrants are needed. But as the trend of fertility decline is happening globally, this solution can really only work temporarily to buy more time, and it has negative consequences due to nativist fears. Nations that take in a lot of immigrants often have a nationalist, anti-immigrant backlash, which is now being observed in Europe and across the Western world, while in countries such as Japan, immigration is very limited. As being a racially homogenous society, it's seen as being very important to Japanese culture. While Japan has begun to take in immigrants, the policies have been mostly focused on encouraging people of Japanese ancestry to come back. That means in nations like Japan, immigration isn't really even a temporary solution if they can't get over this racial homogeny value. So, if falling birth rates are such a major concern for much of the planet, why aren't countries doing more to try and raise birth rates? Well, they have. In Europe, 2/3 of countries have introduced policies to try and raise birth rates. Much of Southeast Asia are following, or have done the same. Russia, for example, has introduced tax offsets for each child a family has, with one-off maternity payments. These policies have raised Russia's birth rate from a historic low in 1999. However, Russia's birth rates are still well below replacement rate. And there can be some very negative policies that are introduced to try and mitigate this. In fact, the effect of low birth rates can have some dramatically negative effect on the status of women's rights. Romania, for example, between 1967 and 1990, under the communist dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, butchered that, adopted a very aggressive pro-natalist policies in an attempt to raise their birth rate from a then low in 1966 of 1.90. Romania's policies included outlawing abortion and contraceptions. Abortion was made legal in Romania in the 1950s, and the Romanian government looked at this and thought that was the cause of their low birth rates. So they banned it. They also outlawed other forms of contraceptions. Routine pregnancy tests for women who were monitored monthly by a gynecologist were introduced. Taxes on childlessness and legal discrimination against childless people. This was enforced with secret police watching hospitals closely and sex education refocused on the benefits of motherhood. It sounds like something from The Handmaid's Tale. Here's the thing. Policy actually worked. In 1966, Romania's birth rate had increased from below replacement level the year before to well above replacement rate at 3.7. This policy lasted for 22 years until the collapse of communist Romania. Although the birth rate did fall again, it remained at a healthy rate until it fell below replacement in 1990, a year after it was abolished. However, this method is obviously unjust and cruel and has its own negative societal effects. The needs of this baby boom were not met. For one, there were too many children. Classes with 40 students were common, and the Romanian economy struggled to cope and develop. They didn't keep up with the needs of this massive generation that they had created. They didn't build enough schooling, kindergartens, high schools, universities, that type of stuff to guide this massive generation. So they struggled. And with high immigration since the fall of the Soviet bloc and low birth rates, Romania now has one of the fastest declining population. The concern is that today's dictatorships with low fertility rates may try to do something similar to what Romania did. Countries such as Hungary have been making access to abortion increasingly difficult, with a recent bill passed on the 15th of September 2022 with a mandatory ultrasound bill, where women who are seeking abortion will now be obliged to listen to the fetal heartbeat before they can have an abortion. Obviously, a form of emotional manipulation. So, this policy, and if this is happening everywhere, you could probably expect more dictatorships to try and introduce these policies. But let's look at some of the more positive and successful examples of tackling low birth rates that don't intrude on human rights. Let's look at France and the Scandinavian countries. France is unique in its demographics. For most of its history, France had Europe's largest population. As France industrialized in the 19th century, France's population grew. But the curiosity was, the growth was significantly less than the rest of the world. France in 1800 had 30 million inhabitants. A century later, it had 40. Germany, comparatively, had gone from 15 million in 1800 to 40 million in 1900. This was a major concern for France. France's population had stagnated during the 19th and 20th centuries, while its neighbors had boomed. Between 1871 and 1911, the French population grew by 8.6%, while the population of Germany grew by 60%. If France had rapid growth comparable to what England and Germany had gone through in the 19th century and what the rest of the world has gone through, then France today would have a population of about 120 to 140 million people. Demographers aren't quite sure why France didn't boom, and this topic is worth its own video. Instead, though, the demographic advantage France once held as the largest nation in Europe disappeared. France was the first country to fall below replacement levels during the First World War in early 1920s, and although it did recover by the time of World War II, it was not large enough. And with the large loss of young men in the First World War and the young men born in between being so small, as the birth rate had not recovered like that it had in Germany, these demographic factors would play a contributing factor into why it capitulated to the Nazis so quickly. Today, though, France has the healthiest demographics in all of Europe, and is set to regain its position as the dominant European power of the century as Germany and Russia's populations collapse. The reason for this is, again, demographics. As Germany and Russia's population collapse, because France suffered due to stagnant and very slow growth during the 19th and early to mid-20th century, France implemented some of the most extensive social policies in the world, providing subsidized childcare for young people and a highly generous benefit system, especially for large families. Families with 2 or more children receive benefits of at least €131.55 per month, and means-tested grants are available, including a payment of €944.51 given at the birth of each child for eligible families. Similar success rates have been seen in the Scandinavian countries due to similar generous policies. In Sweden's parents are also entitled to 480 days of paid parental leave to share between them, with men actually claiming about 30% of all leave. These policies have worked to a degree, and Sweden has raised their birth rates from a low of 1.5 to 1.91, although it has since slipped down again to 1.66 as of 2020, and in France it is 1.83 as of 2019, still the highest in Europe. These rates are far higher than Ukraine, which has a birth rate of 1.22, but are still not enough to prevent a population decline. In countries like America and the Anglo world, their populations have also managed to stay stable. The truth is, the key to attaining this magical 2.1 is not known, and no advanced developed country has actually figured out. For many, any move to boost birth rates now actually too late to stop a population decline. At some point, birth rates in the advanced world will need to rise, and they will have to stabilize at 2.1. They have to for those nations to survive and for humanity to thrive. Until then, stage 6 of this demographic transition model just doesn't exist. And we don't know how to get there yet. I hope you enjoyed this video and subscribe for more. Thanks.